Hey guys, my name is Toby and welcome back to another very exciting tutorial where today we're going to be taking a look at some more basic photography stuff. And I thought we'd start today by talking about shutter speed. Now, shutter speed is probably the simplest of all of these settings to explain, just because I think it's the one that kind of makes the most sense out of all of them. And that is that when you push the button, the shutter in your camera opens up and starts letting in light, and then it stays open for a little while and then it closes and stops letting in light. And basically your shutter speed is just a way of setting the length of time that your camera opens up for. And obviously the longer it's open, the more light can get in, therefore the brighter your shot gets. So before we start talking about kind of what it does and how it works, let's talk about the units that we use to describe it, because it is expressed as a fraction of a second. And you may have seen on the back of your camera that it might just say like 60 or something, and it's like a shutter speed of 60, and it's like, okay, well what that actually means is 1/60th of a second. Equally, if it says 1,000, it probably means 1/1000th of a second. And that's kind of how it gets described. Now what I've got listed here are the full stop values, and you can actually get half stop values and third of a stop values, but just for the purpose of this tutorial I just wanted to talk about the full stop intervals. So you could, for instance, if you look between 1/30th and 1/60th, you could have a 40th and a 50th of a second as well, are shutter speeds that get used by people all the time. If you recall back to last week's video where we talked about exposure and stops, one of the things I brought up was that if you make a photo brighter by one stop, you're actually doubling the amount of light that the camera is kind of collecting. Equally, if you go down a stop and make it darker, you are halving the amount of light. And I want you to notice here that each of these values, they are half and double of each other. So if you want to go from a 30th to a 60th, that is going to make your shot darker by one stop because you are doubling your shutter speed. Equally, if you want to go up a stop, so you want to make it brighter by one stop, you need to half your shutter speed. So 30 in half is obviously 15, and you go for 1/15th of a second. And that works all the way up. Now there are a couple of odd ones. Obviously when you go from 60 to 125th, that's not quite double and half. That's kind of one of the odd exceptions, and that's just because if you suddenly started doing everything in, so you could go to 120, but then the next one up would be 240 and then 480, and it kind of gets a bit harder to remember than 250, 500, 1000. And that's basically the only reason they've done that. Just that little change there just makes it slightly easy to remember. Now the one side effect that shutter speed has is it will actually control your motion blur. And the faster your shutter speed is, the less motion blur you will have. So just think about this for a second. If you've got, let's say you're standing at the side of a racetrack and there's a fast car going past you, and you want to use a half of a second as a shutter speed, and half a second is a very long time for taking a photo. In that half second, that car is going to cover a lot of ground. It's going to move quite a long way, and therefore all of the motion that that car has is going to be captured by your camera. So what you're going to end up with is a big colourful streak going across your screen. Whereas if you start shooting at 1/2000th of a second, in 2000th of a second, you can't really get very far. So therefore it has this effect of freezing the motion as if the car wasn't moving. And this is kind of an artistic thing that you can use to your advantage. It might be something that you want. You might want to have all this motion blur in your shot. You might not. It might be a case of you're taking pictures of your kids in the garden and they're all running around like lunatics and you don't want them to be blurry. You want to see their happy smiling faces. Might be a case of you're taking a picture of a fast jet and you need to go for like a 1/8000th of a second or something ridiculous in order to capture that. It's very much a case of you have to pick your shutter speed depending on the subject. So the last thing I want to talk about in mention of shutter speed is something called the Reciprocal Rule. And the Reciprocal Rule is basically a kind of a guideline for picking an appropriate shutter speed when you're shooting handheld, because it might not be something you've really thought about, but we actually do shake and move around as people. If you're sort of just, holding your camera in your hands, not with a tripod or anything like that, and you're trying to take a picture and you're using a really, really low shutter speed, if you're using like a shutter speed like a whole second, for instance, it's quite hard to stay perfectly still for a whole second. In fact, I'd say it's almost impossible. And even if you're using something like 1/15th of a second, you will move and shake enough, particularly if you don't have very steady hands, where that will get picked up by the camera. So the way to get around this is by using the reciprocal rule, and obviously the reciprocal is the bottom half of a fraction, and the rule states that you should use a shutter speed where the reciprocal is equal to or greater than the focal length of your lens. So if you're shooting at 50mm, that means that you should be using a shutter speed that is at least 1/50th of a second, if not faster than that. And that way it will make sure that you don't pick up any motion blur from your hands, and that should be a good speed to try and handhold shoot at. If you were to start going to like a 40th or a 30th of a second, then you're going to start to shake a little bit more, or it's going to show up more, I should say, in the camera. So equally, if you're shooting with like a 200mm lens, you want to be shooting at least 1/200th of a second, if probably not a little bit more. And that's kind of a good rule of thumb, I think. But I think that's going to be it for shutter speed. Next time, we're going to be taking a look at aperture, so join me then. Thank you very much for watching. My name is Toby, and we'll see you next time.